Taylor Owen, welcome to the show. You spend a lot of time talking to other people about their thoughts on AI and where technology is going, but you have a whole other career on the side of this podcast where you do policy work and you teach at a university. So I thought it might be of some value to turn the camera around a little bit and hear your thoughts on some of these things that we often talk about, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to start. I saw earlier this week that you had signed an open letter along with 70 some odd civil society groups and experts calling on the Carney government to start taking our digital sovereignty a little more seriously.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can just quickly tell me what that letter was all about and what it was calling for.
Yeah, absolutely. So the signatories were a pretty broad range of organizations, including like the Canadian Pediatric Society and teaching associations and civil liberty groups and various technology policy people. So a pretty broad range of organizations and people, all collectively calling on the government to take, as you say, not just our physical sovereignty or our military sovereignty or our industrial economy part of our sovereignty seriously, but also the digital aspect of this issue, how we govern digital technologies, what technologies are built in Canada, how we can control and regulate the technologies that we use in our day-to-day lives.
One of the things that you're calling for is to reintroduce the Online Harms Act. And I wonder if you can explain to people how online safety relates to digital sovereignty. I'm not sure that's an intuitive connection to most people.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the letter calls for all sorts of things, right? So everything from like better data privacy to more compute in Canada and all sorts of things we can talk about. But one piece is how we regulate or oversee or ensure that the content that we see in Canada and the information that we see in Canada is broad, and the products we use, the technology products we use, are safe. And that's ultimately what the Online Harms Act tried to do. It was an act of the government setting rules on the, in this case, social media technologies and products that Canadians use. And it's a sovereignty issue because if we can't govern these things that have such a profound effect on our lives, then are we a real country? If we're devolving all of the responsibility for how those tools work, what kind of information we're receiving, how vulnerable our elections might be, so on and so forth, to a small number of companies in other countries that themselves aren't governing the companies, what are we doing? And so I think that ability to set the rules, the baseline democratic rules for the technologies that we embed in our lives, is an issue of sovereignty in and of itself.
Where does the pushback come from? Because it's hard to imagine why people wouldn't want a safer internet and why people wouldn't want a more sovereign digital infrastructure. So where's the resistance coming from?
Multiple places, but the two main ones are from the US tech industry and from the White House, who are now in lockstep alignment on using the powers of the White House, the powers of U.S. state, to defend and promote the interests of a small number of U.S. tech companies. That's true in the social media and platform space, and also now in the AI space, where there is an unprecedented alignment between the interests of those two very powerful actors. The way it's being deployed is via trade negotiations between the United States government and countries that trade with the U.S. Obviously, we are one of them. We are the largest one, in fact, in the world. We are the country in the world most dependent on trade with the United States, which makes us vulnerable to these kinds of very aggressive maximalist trade negotiations that the U.S. administration is embarking on, not just with us, but with every other country that they trade with. One of the priorities they have in maximizing their position in those negotiations is forcing countries to back down on their existing digital regulations or to cease the development of ones that aren't seen as being in the interest or aligned with the interests of the U.S. tech industry. And we've seen that in Canada. The government backed down on the application of our digital services tax, which, remember, was a piece of legislation passed by the Canadian Parliament. So we democratically decided to impose this tax on American tech companies selling goods or services in Canada. And we have now given that away. We've said that we're going to back down on that in this trade negotiation with the United States. So I think, again, that asks the question of whatever you think of the digital services tax, and we can debate the merits of it or not, But it was a piece of democratically passed legislation that we have now rolled back because of a threat from the United States.
Is it fair to say there's some sort of inconsistency or tension here? On the one hand, we're supposed to be in this elbows up moment, and on the other, we've just dispensed with the digital services tax. We seem reluctant to embark on real, robust digital regulation. What's going on there? Those two things seem like they're at odds with one another.
Yeah, they do. And particularly when you see what other countries have done. The UK entered into a similar trade negotiation with the US, and they kept both their digital services tax and their Online Safety Act, which had already been passed, unlike ours, and was in the process of being implemented. So their elbows on those two issues were more up than ours are. That might be because they're much less dependent on the trade relationship with the United States. We have a lot more at stake in Canada. There's no question about that. And so maybe we're willing to give more to preserve that largely tariff-free relationship that we have come to depend on with the United States. That's one scenario here. But there's some risk for this government. We know that 85% of Canadians want there to be regulations on AI to make it more safe. Right at the same time as the government is saying that we as a country have over-indexed for regulation and they're going to prioritize the development and scaling of the AI sector over any regulation over its use. There's some political liability in that position. Now, they might be willing to accept that political liability because they think the priority and the obligation that they were elected to fulfill, I think it's fair to say, was to save our economy in light of an aggressive attack from a hostile neighbor, which is crazy to say. That's the position we were in, but it was when that election happened. They might say that it's worth giving everything else away to save this relationship, and anything else can come later. But at some point, citizens are going to start demanding that they do the things that they want them to do. And one of the things they very clearly want the government to do is regulate social media and AI. There's no doubt about that. That's where the public will is, which at some point might create a political incentive.
Yeah, and I would say they were certainly elected to defend the economy, but they were also elected to protect our sovereignty. The elbows up were not,
yes.
That was a huge part of the campaign, and it seems like we've really weighted one side of that platform at the expense of the other.
That's such a good point, because I actually think my perception of the election was people were prioritizing that sovereignty over the economy.
I agree.
We were willing to take a hit on our economy in order to protect our sovereignty. So now why are we all of a sudden prioritizing that economic relationship over all other aspects of sovereignty? I should say all. We are also building our military. We are also dropping interpersonal trade barriers, or in the process of, we're also building big resource projects to build our sovereignty, right? So we are doing things, but we're clearly not doing really very much at all in the digital space, other than trying to scale Canadian companies that work in the digital domain, which is an important thing to do. I think we should be doing that. But I don't think we can do that on its own, particularly if we want Canadians to adopt these technologies, because they're saying very clearly, we are reluctant to use these technologies, particularly AI, in our lives, in our workplaces, in our schools, because we don't fully trust it, and we want you to ensure they are safe. And then we will adopt it. So if we want to build that Canadian tech sector, and we want to build the Canadian adoption of AI, which I think should be a priority, honestly, we also need to govern it. And that's what this government so far has proven hesitant to embark on.
I assume Carney doesn't read this letter and implement a whole sweeping regime of digital policy regulation.
But he may. You never know.
True.
Glass half full.
It's true. I should be more optimistic.
It could be that an open letter changes everything. You never know.
As it often does. It often does.
Yeah, as we know.
Let's assume that doesn't happen. Fine. What should Canadians be looking for? The first inclinations that we may be moving in the right direction, that the government is taking this seriously, that they're listening to the very clear demands of the Canadian public. Yeah. What does that look like?
I think there's a few things. One, I'm not sure they should be retabling broad AI regulations right now. I actually think they're right to put a bit of a pause on that. I don't think we know what that means, frankly, with this technology that's evolving so rapidly. But at the very least, they should be consulting with Canadians on how they want that to look. I think they need to take that seriously and not delay that process of meaningfully speaking to Canadians about how they think this technology is affecting their lives so profoundly should be regulated. So I think they need to start that process. And I also think they need to put some basic safety standards around these technologies. So I think we have a good framework for that, which is the Online Harms Act. So I think retabling the Online Harms Act and adding AI and chatbots into it would go a long way to showing people. Wouldn't solve every problem, but it would at least show people that the government cares about the concerns they have, which is the safety of these chatbots on their kids, their protection from AI fraud, which is running rampant through the Canadian economy right now. So I think there's a couple things they could do there on the policy side. The other thing I think they could do is maybe not give away every one of our existing digital regulations to the United States. I have a feeling there's willingness to also get rid of our Online News Act. Again, regardless of how what anyone thinks of the policy, it was a democratically passed policy that I think we should revisit it and debate it, but on our own terms. And I think we've given up the digital services tax, and that's unfortunate, but maybe it was needed. We weren't behind the scenes in those negotiations, and maybe they were right to give it up. But I think giving away all of our digital regulations, the Online News Act, the Online Streaming Act, would signal, and then not tabling anything else, would really signal that we're ceding our digital sovereignty to a country that's expressed some pretty clear hostility to us and is trying to weaken our sovereignty, I think, quite explicitly. And in my view, that would be a huge mistake.
And it remains to be seen what we're getting in return for some of those concessions as well. I think that's
it. At some point, the government's also going to have to start explaining, I think, the trade-offs here. It would be easier to take trading off the digital services tax if we knew clearly what we were getting in return. And I think at some point that's going to have to be explained more clearly to the Canadian public.
Let's talk a little bit about the stakes here. I think for a long time, the AI safety debate was framed as one of existential risk, that the AIs were going to become all-powerful and take over the world and destroy humankind. That hasn't happened. It may never happen, but we are starting to see some very real, tangible threats and dangers happening right now.
Yeah.
I suspect many people have already seen some of these stories, but there's a story in the New York Times reporting on a 16-year-old named Adam Rain who took his own life after developing a friendship with ChatGPT. I'm just going to give you a couple of sort of details from the reporting because I think they're clarifying and important. So this young teenager, Adam, had been speaking. He was clearly going through mental health issues. He was communicating those mental health issues to ChatGPT, including suicidal thoughts. ChatGPT told him to seek help, but there were also some more damning interactions. So at one point, Adam made an attempt on his own life, and the chatbot told him how he might be able to cover up the evidence of that attempt, the marks on his neck. And in one of Adam's final messages to ChatGPT, he actually sent a photo of the noose that he'd tied and asked ChatGPT whether it would work, and ChatGPT provided that answer. All of that is horrifying. His parents, like several other families now, are suing OpenAI, essentially accusing them of wrongdoing and laying some of the responsibility at that company's feet. Give me your sense of the feasibility of some of these lawsuits and whether you think that is going to be an effective path forward here in bringing these companies to some degree of accountability.
Yeah, obviously the cases are shocking, and there's been a number of them, and we recorded that conversation last year with one of the mothers whose son had also taken his life in similar circumstances, which I think affected us both pretty dramatically. It was a very difficult conversation, and there have been a number of cases of these. Whether there's going to be legal liability here for these companies is a really difficult question, and it's certainly beyond the bounds of my knowledge. And I think it's going to be difficult because the nature of our relationships with AI are something very different and new. This is not a Google search result coming back with an answer saying you should kill yourself. This is a relationship that was built up over time, and a relationship, I think, in a real sense, particularly of the case of Sewell, who had this relationship with a character in an AI called Character AI, the boy whose mother we spoke to. Those are real relationships, and they developed over time, and there was trust between them, and the AI was giving him something he desperately needed, which was counsel and support and attention and love in a real way. And anyone who read that transcript of the conversation he had and the one that this more recent case had, I think would see how the recipient of that information would perceive that as helping them to commit suicide or to take their own life. But where you pinpoint that liability, I think, is going to be very difficult to demonstrate. So I know that's a bit convoluted, but I just don't think it's hard to find a smoking gun in these other than the collective nature of the relationship, and that relationship is something new. Now, whether these legal cases will make a difference, there I think they will. I think the U.S. governs through litigation, and they do not govern technology in any meaningful way, but they do sue people pretty effectively in America. And class actions in particular have had huge impact on big industrial sectors in the history of the American industrial economy. And I think the big class action against the social media companies is the best scenario for changing the behavior of those social media companies in the US. And the same is probably true here. That at some point, those cases, whether or not they succeed, pressure corporate change in the US, and that will then, because we don't govern these things ourselves, as we just talked about, that will have a spillover effect in Canada if that happens.
And we've already started to see some of that. After that Adam Raines story came out, ChatGPT, OpenAI announced that they were going to allow for parental controls on ChatGPT, which they hadn't done prior. Now, whether that's sufficient, I think that's another question, but it's clear that they are responding to some of this reporting and some of these lawsuits with policy changes internally.
Yeah, and not to draw this back to a policy conversation, though, in our previous question here, but it's a pretty clear case for where if we had the Online Safety Act in place, it would have led to a very different set of behaviors from these companies, in that they wouldn't be changing their policies after the fact. They'd be doing risk assessments on their products before they launch them on the public. And you better believe that having conversations with teenagers about taking their own lives and how and why they might want to do that would be captured by a risk assessment if you were launching a chatbot into a Canadian market. And so I think that's a really clear case for this kind of risk-based regulation that we have so far failed to pass in Canada and are therefore less safe and more vulnerable because of that legislative failure.
I think that's so important because I think these legal cases at the end of the day will hinge on some degree of causality, of showing that the chatbot caused this to happen. And I agree with you, that's a high threshold to pass, but that doesn't mean that these products are safe or that they're not. I think that gap is where policy could and should intervene because it's clear that there are risks, even if there's not a causality element.
Totally. The worst cases and the most jarring and shocking cases are powerful, of kids taking their own lives, but they can also distract us, I think, from a much broader set of concerns that are present in these technologies that could be captured under these kinds of consumer safety risk assessment processes. So another example that is very different than the one you mentioned, but was Meta deploying chatbots into their ecosystem targeted at kids and being allowed to have sexual conversations with children or with teenagers. And one of them was a stepmom, right? And all of these thousands of teenage boys started having sexual conversations with this chatbot as if it was their real friend on Instagram and Facebook. And is that the end of the world? No. Would you have flagged that when you were launching this product in Canada if you were forced to do assessments on how kids, particularly how kids, might use your products? Without question. So again, that was something that was deployed, we were experimented on, and then retroactively, once we see the harm, maybe there's going to be an adjustment. Maybe, I'm not even sure there is, frankly, but maybe there will be. But that shouldn't be the way we come across this. We should be doing those assessments first before we deploy the technology on our society and on our children, in our schools. Let's make sure they're safe first and then use them. And that's what this kind of regulation tries to do.
And absent that kind of regulation, and not to defend Meta, but there was nothing technically illegal, as far as I know, about designing their bot until we have more robust, until we have an Online Harms Act or a Kids Online Safety Act in the States.
Even then, it won't be illegal. And legality isn't the issue here. The big challenge with these regulations, and why only using the legal system, as some, including our current Prime Minister, has proposed to do for child safety, right, is to just change our legal system. is that a lot of the behavior that we probably want to minimize or disincentivize is not illegal. That doesn't mean it's not harmful. And we might not want to maximize for it. We might want to minimize for it and create incentives to minimize it rather than incentives to maximize it. And that's what we're talking about with these regulations, just trying to turn the incentive structure to make it so that things that aren't like, you're allowed, like kids are allowed and should have sexual conversations with AIs and people, and that's part of being a person. Do we want that content to be flooded into their streams and incentivized over all others with no guardrails on it, with powerful AIs that know their lives intimately? I don't know. I don't really want that for my kid, but maybe we can just torque the dial a little bit or incentivize the dial to move a little bit so that we get the good things of these technology, more of the good things and less of the bad things. And that's not a question of legality. It's a question of incentives and design.
The last thing I want to ask you on this, and this is maybe a thorny question.
Unlike the other two, which were easy.
No, those were softballs.
Yeah.
Is there a chance that some of these behaviors are endemic to the technology? I think what we've seen with all of these is there's a certain degree of sycophancy with these chatbots. They're designed to encourage and reinforce your thinking.
Yeah.
And whether it's people going into conspiratorial rabbit holes or teenagers contemplating self-harm, or people using these chatbots as their therapists and they're giving bad advice as therapists.
Yeah.
Can that be fixed, or is that endemic to the idea of a chatbot?
That's such a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think we collectively know the answer to that. We were talking the other day about this essay by Mustafa Suleiman, who is like a pretty prominent AI scholar who is now based at Microsoft. And he's warning of widespread psychosis being induced by AI chatbots, and that being a core failure of these models and a feature in a sense, right? It's something they drift towards based on their design. And I don't know. I think that's a real concern here. That have we built something that has some designed failures or negative use cases that it naturally drifts towards? And I don't know the answer to that. But again, it's something we're figuring out because we've deployed it en masse in society without thinking this through beforehand. And I think a little bit more precaution is probably going to be needed, particularly as these models get more and more powerful and we embed them in more and more aspects of our lives.
I think the scariest part is I also don't know, and take your point that you don't know, but I'm not sure the people building these companies know.
That's what I was getting at. Like my we wasn't you and I. Like, of course you guys don't know.
We're idiots.
Certainly not building large language models. But I agree with you. I think that's what's unique about AI is we're building a technology we, by design, can't understand. And therefore, it's one way to understand its effect is for us all to collectively use it and accept the risks that come with that. Is that one citizens want to do? Is that a bargain citizens are willing to make? And so far, they haven't been given the choice. I bet, and what I think, is that they would rather there be a few more guardrails around this experiment than there currently are. And at some point, I think they're going to start demanding them in a way that is heard politically. And that might be starting to happen now.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned, Canadians have been slow to adopt some of these technologies for exactly those reasons. Now, one group that hasn't been slow to adopt this technology, though, is students. In particular, university students. You're heading into a new semester. I think for the last year or two now, the question of what to do about AI in the classroom and on campus has been the dominant question perplexing teachers and academics. Yeah. Do you have any sense of how you're going to grapple with it this semester?
I think it's the use of these particularly chatbots by students up at 2,000 years of how universities have functioned in Western society. It's that big a shock to the system. The entire way we've taught and that we've learned as humans can be shortcut and undermined by this technology. It likely can be enhanced in some ways, and I think we need to figure out what those are. But the model of pedagogy that we use in universities is now broken, fundamentally. The challenge with that is that universities are large, slow-moving bureaucratic institutions that have proven fairly inept at rapidly adapting to major shocks and are also in a fairly precarious position right now. They're under attack ideologically, financially, and they're not in a great position to radically rethink their role in society at this very moment. And so what I see inside universities and the ones that I'm either affiliated with or in contact with is almost paralysis with the scale and degree of the change that's going to be required. And professors certainly, and in the conversations I have and that I'm thinking through myself, really don't know what to do. There is not a model for how to react to students using a technology that undermines the very way you have taught your entire career. So it's a very big problem, and it's one that I think is going to change what a university is. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
And it's an existential challenge for these universities. I think if they don't adapt, then they become irrelevant. Why go to a lecture or read a book when you can just go to ChatGPT for that? I think that there needs to be a fundamental reimagining of pedagogy and of the university experience if they're going to have value that ChatGPT can't provide.
And sometimes these sort of dramatic changes forces one to look in the mirror a little bit too. And I think it's forcing a reflection on universities and on professors and on departments to really question and ask what their purpose is and what they're trying to get across and what they're trying to teach and do. And clearly, if it's just how to write an essay or how to regurgitate information in a textbook or in an academic article, that is going to prove insufficient in light of these technologies. I can no longer ask students to read 5 articles a week and write an essay based on their comprehension of those articles. What I will get back, if it's in digital form, is, because of how we all now work, going to be largely influenced or created in various ways by AI. So something is broken with that model. But is that my job, right? Just to get them to regurgitate information? Or is it to help them learn how to think? Or to shape their thought process at a time when their brains are developing, and learning how to think is really important in your early 20s, and that's probably a priority. On the other hand, people go to universities to get jobs as well. And if we just cloister ourselves and don't engage with these technologies at all, are we also doing a disservice to students who are, the day after they graduate, if they're lucky enough to get a job, which is getting harder and harder, going to be told by everyone older than them in that, which is going to be almost everybody, wherever they end up working, they're going to be asked how to use AI and to teach others how to use it. Because it's going to be expected that they're more embedded in the use of that technology than others. So we also can't put our heads in the sand here. So it's a wicked problem.
I think you touched on an important point there, though, which is that some of these things have likely been broken for a lot longer. AI has shone a light on some of these but I think they're existing failings of the way that we've been teaching for decades. And there was probably a lot broken, and now I think you're right. Is the purpose of a university degree so you can regurgitate information, or is it so you can think critically? And maybe we weren't doing the best job of teaching people how to think critically in the old model.
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly the case. And it's going to be different in different universities with different types of classes. But like the idea of a 1,000-person lecture class where you go and listen or even watch on a remote screen a professor lecture for an hour, and then you write an essay based on some of the readings later on. That model was broken before AI. Or in my view, is inadequate before AI, but evolved as a function of the financial model of the university and the demands placed on a university and the demand for university education from society writ large that required us to scale this form. Now, like if you were teaching a 12-person seminar where you're just talking through issues every week, that model was always good and isn't broken, frankly. But you can't scale that. We just had this interview with Niall Ferguson this week, who is British and comes from the Oxbridge tradition, where that tutorial model is it, where you sit with a world-renowned professor with 4 other students for 3 hours straight and talk about things. That model is going to work great in a world of AI. But you can't do that with undergrad classes of thousands of students.
You could try, but it's directly in tension with the financial incentives of the university.
Yeah, I mean,
it would be incredibly expensive to do that.
Sure. And I bet we're going to see some exclusive and very expensive institutions emerge that do that for people who prioritize that and can afford it. Is that something we can do in a world where we've told society and citizens that in order to become part of the middle class, you need to have an undergraduate education, right? Like that's the bargain that is in real tension with this new technology, I think.
And that's a scary bifurcation that you're describing there, where
absolutely
the elite can go to these into Oxbridge-esque, intimate seminar-style education, and everyone else hops online and does AI learning and virtual learning, and there's already a bit of that happening, but it's a sort of the logical consequence of those trends.
But it's not all doom and gloom here. We've talked about this a lot. The way everybody is trying to experiment with using these tools, and they're like immensely powerful for a lot of the things we do in fields that are adjacent to or within the academy. Writing and researching and managing teams of people doing work together and coming up with ideas and innovating. A lot of those things are enhanced in really powerful ways by AI. And so I think it's incumbent on people within those institutions to figure out the new norms of how we are going to use them and what we think is acceptable in our fields of work for writing, for researching, for publishing, for all the things we do. And if we're not doing that, how can we oppose those constraints on students who are themselves trying to figure those things out? So I don't know the answer to that, right? Like in my class last year, I made students write in blue books their final essays, right? And they came in at the end of the year and sat for 3 hours and wrote in notebooks. And you better believe that these like mid-20s graduate students had not spent 3 hours handwriting in cursive for a very long time. And it was a difficult exercise. And the result was I had to mark chicken scratch and try and decipher hundreds of pages of poorly scripted text in these things. But they went into it knowing fully well that this is why we were doing it. And they were perfectly fine with doing it, frankly. And the result was I got a clarity of their thought out of those books that I wouldn't have gotten if we had done it digitally, because I wouldn't have known how they created it and what thought process developed it. And so that's one scenario that we're going to see a lot of. But this is going to require thinking creatively and seriously about it. And things like just asking students not to plagiarize and not to use AI, or if they do, to cite it, are just so missing the way these technologies are used. These aren't something that can be cited and used in a bespoke, singular way and then recorded. These are things that are fundamentally embedded in people's workflows. And so we have to acknowledge that, I think, as a first step.
We were even talking about you need a new definition of plagiarism as well, because what is cheating in this context? Obviously, getting an AI to generate an essay for you and then using that essay verbatim is plagiarism. But what if you get it to brainstorm the idea for the essay or do the outline for the essay? Yeah. It's a fundamentally different technology than one we've seen before, and I think we need a fundamentally different approach.
I would say even that it's clearly cheating, I think, under our current constraints and rules. But it is a different kind of plagiarism, if we're going to use that word, than how we've used it before. Because plagiarism implies, and again, the word plagiarism is a very triggering one inside universities because it has huge consequences. One case of plagiarism can ruin someone's career or can ruin a student's life. So using it holds tremendous weight within the university. And we better be really careful, I think, applying that word to something that 90+% of students are doing, right? Better be careful, and what most faculty are using too, frankly. So let's be a little careful using that word, I think, as a community. But plagiarism also implied stealing the work from somebody else. It wasn't just about what you did, it was about the consequence of what you did. That you wrote something and I stole it, or a piece of it, and used it and pretended it was mine. Is that what's happening with AI? I'm not so sure. It might have been in early models where we were seeing clear fragments of other people's text inside output, or we talked about with Ed Newton Rex, like when a music model was regurgitating snippets of copyrighted songs. That is plagiarism. But creating a new essay based on the collective knowledge it has developed in a way we don't understand how it generated, I'm not sure that's plagiarism. It could very well be cheating, depending on how we define cheating. But I think a lot of this is going to require some rethinking. And again, the kind of norms that we've developed over centuries within universities and within community, even something like writing. I think the idea of writing is going to change, what writing is, and the norms around writing are going to change. But also how we adjudicate and evaluate the work of others is clearly going to have to change. But not just by imposing slightly new versions of these old constructs onto our work, but I think probably by rethinking them.
The plagiarism question is fascinating because, in a sense, I agree we need a new definition of plagiarism because, in a sense, these AI companies have stolen intellectual property, trained their models on it, and it's just spitting out something that looks different enough from the original thing, but they aren't really attributing or licensing the existing work properly. So I agree with you, it's not plagiarism in the conventional sense, but there is a degree in which that is plagiaristic.
It is plagiarism adjacent.
Exactly.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think it is certainly the case that these companies have stolen the work of millions of individuals in order to create this new technology. To me, that is undeniable. There's a big question of whether they should be held liable for having done that, or if we're okay with them doing it because the technology they've built is so remarkable that we're okay. We're going to give them a pass on this one because they made AGI or they're close, whatever. Like, maybe that's worth it. But I don't think we should delude ourselves that's what they did. They stole as much information as they could in order to make their model as smart as possible. That doesn't necessarily mean that the output is entirely derivative of the things that went into it. And that's where I think the plagiarism metaphor breaks down a little bit. Everyone has different experiences with these things. But this idea that all the model is doing is stringing together words in the most likely way based on the things it's seen before trivializes a little bit, I think, how people experience it and what it's actually doing. And I do think it's creating something new and is thinking in some broad way. Maybe not exactly like humans do, clearly, but it's creating something new. It's not solely derivative, in my view, or in my experience. At least I've had moments of that. And if that is where it's headed, to be generative in the true sense of the word, then it's not plagiarism. It is a little bit more akin to a mind learning and then being able to come up with new ideas itself. And that's not plagiarism for humans. So it might not be for machines either.